I want to talk about choosing a technology stack. How do I approach the process of selecting the right technology stack for a new web development project? And what factors do you consider when evaluating trade offs between different frameworks, libraries, and tools? So, I would say, what is the purpose of the project? Is the purpose to try something new? Is it to work with new technologies? Is it just something that you're doing as a hobby? Is it something that you don't think is going to persist for a long time? Those kind of decisions would go into account when choosing a technology stack. So, if you are writing a to do app, for example, and you're just doing it so that you can learn new technologies, then at that point, like I would be a little more open to trying different things. So, like, let me see what it's like to do CSS with styled components, or let me see what it's like to use the Remix framework. In those cases, that's where I would venture out and try new technologies that I haven't worked with before, that I don't know how, I don't want to say like reliable, but yeah, maybe like how reliable, how maintainable they are. But if this is a project that I'm really wanting to take seriously, I want to go for tools that are kind of very robust. What do I mean by that? Basically, I want tools that I'm confident that they're going to be maintained for a long time, that there's a lot of community behind those tools. Take, for example, the Tailwind CSS project. Now, Tailwind is a relatively new project. It's at least a few years old right now, but relatively new. However, there is a huge, huge, huge amount of adoption. Like, the documentation is very solid. There is hype on Tailwind, but I truly believe the hype is for a good reason. And there's just a very strong value proposition. There's just a huge community around Tailwind. And even if the maintainers of Tailwind were to drop off the face of the earth, I think that that project would still live on. I think that there would be people that would step up to the plate and continue to maintain that project. So it's kind of a long-winded way of saying that, like, I'm really looking for projects that have robust support, and kind of a robust community backing it. So if I'm in a JavaScript environment and I'm working with NPM, I'm gonna look at the NPM number of installs, and if it is a serious project and I'm looking at a package that, only has 50 npm installs, I'm going to be less confident about that package. I'm going to be less likely that I'm going to bring it into my project, because when you have a project that has so low of npm installs, it's usually a good indicator that the project is pretty immature. There's not that much community behind the project. And while it may be a solid library, it's just really hard to say that that maintainer isn't going to get pulled off in another direction and not support that project, which is totally reasonable. We can't expect all maintainers of open source projects to basically work for free, essentially. I would say that that's kind of a big one for me, is just the community adoption. With something like Tailwind, or with something like Next.js, there's just a really strong community, and it seems to me like it would be a pretty solid choice. There's this phrase that's like, I like boring technologies, and not that Tailwind or Next.js is boring. Those two projects are probably would be considered cutting edge for web development. But like, if you think of something like a PHP app, right? That's, you're like server rendering it on the back end, and you're using jQuery, and you're using all these like dated technology, quote unquote. Like, why would you build a web app like that? But those technologies are still solid technologies, and they've been around for, many, many years since, like, very early on in kind of the web development world. And so, like, even something like PHP server rendered with jQuery, I feel like something like that would be a fine choice. Look at Peter Levels. He, as far as I know, he uses like a kind of bare bones PHP setup. I mean, like, he's not using like a heavy framework like Laravel or something like that. He's just using PHP server rendered, like a LAMP stack, so like a Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. So just like really kind of like, what a lot of people would consider old school, but he's making these really modern web apps that are generating quite a bit of income for him. I don't know. I wouldn't balk at like a older technology just because it's older, and just because there's newer stuff available now, because these technologies are mature. But that's the thing, is like a lot of people would look at those technologies and say that they're boring. When I'm looking for technologies, I like the boring technologies. Like, I like the technologies that are tried and true. I'll disclose that I'm not a PHP developer. I'm not too familiar with PHP. So would I choose PHP personally? No, because I don't know PHP. And so that would be another thing to think about, is but when choosing a technology stack, is like, what do you know? And if you're trying to get a project off the ground and you're a JavaScript developer, you probably just want to build something in JavaScript and not go and build something in Java or PHP or something. And you might be served to just build something with kind of the tools that you already know. So that kind of like knowledge of what you know is another factor here. That also kind of goes for if you wanted to work on a project or choose a technology stack for a team of people. Like, it's one thing if you're working on a solo project, you kind of have free reins to choose whatever you want. But let's say you are choosing a technology stack and, you're in kind of a work situation, and there's going to be many people working on this or having to use this technology, and they'll probably have to use the technology after you leave the company. So in those cases, it's important to be mindful, like, again, going back to the robust technologies, but also kind of going back to, like, what are some technologies that kind of would be easy to hire for? It's going to be a lot easier to hire a Java developer or a JavaScript developer than it is to hire a Haskell developer. And while Haskell might be your favorite programming language and you think that it's very clever and it has beautiful syntax and beautiful properties, it may not be the best choice if you're trying to have other people use it, because it's arguably a esoteric language, and other people are probably going to have to learn Haskell first before they can start contributing. So thinking about like the bigger picture and thinking about, is this easy to hire for? Like, a ton of developers know Java. So if your project is in Java, then you can kind of remove the like language barrier, and you can just get them like understanding what's going on rather than trying to figure out like syntax details. But that is to say, like, we're all malleable. Our brains are have plasticity, and we can learn new languages, sure. And a lot of languages are close enough to that C-like syntax where, if you know Java, well, you can look at a Go program and you can know roughly what's going on. You might have some questions about certain things here or there, but so I wouldn't say it's like a complete blocker if it's a little bit more of an esoteric language. But if it's something that is like completely like paradigm changing, and I would just say it's a ratio, right? It's like the If it's very, very esoteric, it's gonna be harder to find people to hire, that are experts in that language. You might be able to find people that want to learn the language, you gotta realize that they're new to the language, they're not really experts in that language. So then the next thing to think about here is, what is the use case of the app? And that is going to drive what kind of technology stack you'd want to use. So, like understanding how you would model the data in your app should drive the decision making on what kind of data store you would want to use. Should you use a SQL database or should you use a key value database? Well, key value store might be quicker, but it might be harder to do more complex queries. So understanding like the intended use case, it should also be in the question for what kind of technology you would use. Personally, I like to use SQL databases for kind of the app's heavy lifting. And what I mean by that is like, storing all the user data, storing all the domain objects in the app. I tend to like SQL databases because I find you can do a pretty good job at keeping the data pretty neat and organized by setting up foreign key relationships. To me, just the way storing things in kind of a normalized form, just it tends to make it easier to design for. And like when you need to extend your app, it's in my opinion pretty intuitive to add, like knowing what database tables and what foreign keys to add to the database. Whereas when like in a key value kind of situation or in a document type of database such as MongoDB, just in my opinion, it's a little bit harder to design for those type of schemas. And I find that you kind of have to know what your data is going to be structured like up front, which is very difficult, especially, and projects evolve over time. So it just gets harder and harder to like predict what the data is going to be long term. And so I find that SQL databases are easier to grow organically without compromising the integrity of the data. However, document databases also have their use cases. For example, if you are working with data where you don't know what the structure is, you're getting some JSON from some third party source and you don't have any control over what that data structure is going to look like, then a document store could be the right choice. While in SQL you can, in a lot of SQL databases, store JSON inside of one of the columns, but it might make sense to use a document database which is like optimized for that purpose of like just dumping in data. But I from my experience, I feel like trying to make structured data in more like NoSQL style databases is a little bit trickier to design for. And I find that when you're working on a team and kind of like what you're handed is a NoSQL database, then you're also counting on all the other developers to know how to kind of design for that database. Like I was working on a project once that they were using DynamoDB, which is a NoSQL database. Like when you're designing for DynamoDB, a NoSQL database, the recommended best practice is to go with a one table design for your domain object. And a lot of times you would have DynamoDB in kind of a microservice architecture where let's say you have let's say like a user service or something. And so then you might have a user DynamoDB table where the key, of course, is the user ID, and then the value is like all the data for that user. So that's the recommended approach, is to kind of have one table. But anyway, I worked on a project that was using DynamoDB, but it was designed as if it were a SQL database. And frankly, it was probably not the right call because there was 4 DynamoDB tables. There was like a link DynamoDB table. There was a I can't remember, but like a user table and like a post or some sort of like object like that. Like there was like 4 tables to map all these relationships. So what happened then was basically all the stuff that you would normally do with a SQL query, basically they were doing all that like on the server in like application code. So they were basically like writing custom joins and like filtering logic and stuff like that. And it was all like on the application side. In my opinion, I think like DynamoDB was not the right technology for that use case. And like that app probably would have been better served with a SQL setup if they wanted to design it in that way. And again, that's kind of why I like SQL databases a lot because I feel like they're just easier to extend and grow over time. When requirements inevitably change, you can add another table, set up more foreign keys, and it's usually just easier, I think, to go and extend it. Again, NoSQL databases have their strengths, and there's certainly valid use cases for them. I remember a friend of mine said that they worked on like a messaging service team. And now I want to say they were using a SQL database, but they were using it like a key value store. And so something like a chat system, and you're just doing writes all the time, you're just writing the different chat messages all the time. Maybe something like that, a NoSQL database would be a good option. And again, I think these like more specialized databases, such as NoSQL databases, I find that they make more sense when we get into these like super large scale microservice, like gigantic teams, like corporate enterprises type thing, where the use cases are like extremely, I don't know, bespoke, and you're just trying to like optimize every little angle. But on a smaller project, like especially if you're like like doing one team, you're like one developer, like building a project, I am going to be choosing a SQL database probably 99% of the time. Again, it's what I know. It's easier to extend, and you could do something like you can choose something like Postgres, and it's a massive open source project with massive amount of support, with a ton of community, a ton of people use Postgres. I would say MySQL is kind of in a similar realm here. It's an extremely popular database, and it's solid. Also, I would think about how much all of this infrastructure and how much all of these technology choices are going to cost you. But you could use some proprietary database. What is that going to cost you? There's been a lot of interesting work from the Basecamp folks, the people that developed the Ruby on Rails framework, where they're moving off of the big cloud, basically like I'm guessing AWS, whatever cloud they were using before, and they're switching to running their systems like on premises, so running or either managing their own servers or like figuring out a smaller hosting provider to manage them. Their claim was that like at scale, AWS was actually costing them a fortune. And like a lot of what AWS does is they just take open source projects and they manage those projects for you. So like, you spin up an RDS, which is the SQL database offering from AWS. You take a RDS service and you pay a premium, and they are managing the RDS or the Postgres database for you. They'll handle upgrading it, they'll handle security patches for it. There's a trade-off there. And when you're a very small company, like when let's say you're one person, let's say you're just one person developing a project, you really don't want to spend time like thinking about like setting up databases and configuring things. And you kind of just want a lot of that stuff to kind of work out of the box, assuming your goal is to make a product and not to, if you're just trying to learn how to do it, then that's one thing. And yeah, by all means, like, set it all up yourself if it's like an educational experience. But, if the goal is to, like, build a product, you really don't wanna be spending a lot of time, like, fiddling with databases and, like, low level stuff like that. So, like, for the smaller companies, perhaps the cost is more justified to use a tool like Vercel or to use a tool like Heroku. But if, when a project is moving, like, when you're kind of more at scale, I think that's the conclusion that the Basecamp people are coming against, is that the AWS, cloud is very expensive, and it's cheaper and more economical for them to bring all those cloud service and managed service offerings on-prem and just do it themselves. And it makes sense. It's not like AWS is not like a it's not necessarily like a push to start solution. Like, you're going to need people that are extremely knowledgeable about these, like, low level systems, even if you're using a managed service. I think there's maybe like a false kind of idea that, like, if you're using AWS, like, you don't have to even think about SRE at all, or site reliability at all, or you don't have to even think about the database at all. But you still need to have people that, like, know what they're doing with these systems. So it's not like it abstracts all of it away from you, and it's like when it's fully managed and it's like they're handling every single problem. It's really not like that. It's there's still like a cost to, like, have personnel to manage these systems, these RDS, etc., for the organization. So then there's the other kind of end of the spectrum, which is like the Vercel side, which is basically like another layer up from AWS. And with them, they are more of a push to start type of solution, where you can basically set up your GitHub repo, connect it to Vercel, and you push a commit to your main branch, and all of a sudden, a CI pipeline starts up and your app is deployed, and everything is like a very seamless experience. And now they've introduced databases and Redis key value stores and like object storage. And now I haven't used these, but, like, I imagine it's pretty much you just click some buttons and, like, you're off to the races very easily. That's my impression. Because, I mean, everything that I've worked with Vercel, it's been a very nice user experience. But however, that user experience comes at a cost. You pay a premium to use Vercel, and Vercel at scale could be prohibitively expensive. And when you use a system like Vercel, and let's say you want to break out of Vercel and try to figure out a cheaper alternative, it might be hard to get out of there because everything's very tightly integrated. It's almost like Apple. It's once you're in the Apple ecosystem and you've got all the adapters and the computers and everything is talking to each other, and then you want to try to move away from Apple. Well, everything's not going to work as seamlessly with the systems that are not Apple. Maybe it's a convoluted example, but the idea is that with these hosting providers, and when thinking about, like, choosing a technology stack, how easy would it be to escape? Like, what does the escape hatch look like? Like, what's the vendor lock-in situation with such a tool? So there's two, like, frames of references that I'm thinking about here when choosing a technology stack. There's one frame of reference, which is like, I am at an established company or like a larger startup, and we've already have a business off the ground. Like, we already have funding, there's employees, and the choice of technology for that situation would be different than the choice of technology for a one person indie hacker that's just trying to build a product, get it off the ground. For the indie hacker, one person team, you're just trying to build a product, I would say don't worry too much about the technology stack. Use what you know, use what you think will help you get up and running quickly, and go with that. Use Vercel if that means that you can get your product off the ground. don't worry about trying to scale the product and am I going to be able to escape from Vercel and am I going to be able to host my own database in the future to save me money? Don't worry about that. If you have to worry about that, then that's going to be a good problem. What you should do is just focus on building your product, making it as easy as possible. I would recommend just like using the Vercel hobby tier if that's possible for you and just see what happens. Like just build and until you reach those limits where it's okay, this is like starting to cost me like an extremely large amount of money. And then at that point, you have a good problem. And that's the point where you have to figure it out. And hopefully by that point, there's like more people working on your project or you have more resources to help you figure out that problem. But you don't want to spend too much time trying to optimize your technology stack at the beginning if you're just trying to build a product. If you're interested in learning and that's your goal and you're not trying to build a product, you're just trying to learn, then at that point, pick what interests you. Pick the things that you've been wanting to learn. That would be a good opportunity to try out different tools because there's not that expectation in the back of your mind that you need this to scale to 1 million people, and you're just doing it for fun, and it's just a fun hobby project to learn. And then on the other end here is the kind of more established company, or you're in a work scenario where you're working with a team and you're in a larger organization. And then at that point, it's better to think about what's the goal? Is it like to get to market as quick as possible and cost is not an issue? Okay, then it's probably more similar to the startup where you just want to think about building the product. Or are you trying to reduce your burn? At that point, that's when you start to think about, okay, do I need to spin up this extra infrastructure? Do I need to scale up this database to 1,000 gigabytes of RAM? I don't know, maybe it's a crazy example, but anyway, I think that's pretty much what I've got for this question here. Let me know in the comments what you guys would consider as are important aspects to choosing technology. And yeah, hope you found it entertaining or useful. And until then, I'll see you in the next one.